Okay, hi, welcome back. My name's Claire Cunningham, and I'm going to give a short presentation until lunch, I believe. I just want to make first a little access announcement that I like to do both in my performance, but also applies here. Firstly, if anybody needs to leave to use the bathroom, leave because they need a break, leave and come back, leave and don't come back. It's absolutely fine. These things are all acceptable. If people need to make sound to be comfortable, these things are also fine. One thing about access I've learned is that spaces that have a formality or that we have presumed there are rules of behaviour make access difficult. So sometimes it's interesting to think, what are the rules of the space that I'm presuming? And you should feel free to break those. I will be also, for the audio describer, I will be including audio description throughout my presentation. So also one of the first things I also like to do when doing presentations or workshops is to include a self-description first. So, as I said, my name is Claire Cunningham. I am a short, just under 5 foot, white woman with very short grey hair. I use 2 elbow crutches, which are grey and of a quite old-fashioned design that you find often in the UK, where I'm based. Today I am wearing a pair of black boots, black jeans, and a red t-shirt that says, "The future is accessible." I'm sitting on a little black stool behind the lectern. I use the pronouns she and her. So I'm just going to pull my stool a bit closer. There we go. So I have an introductory slide, an image behind me, and I will be describing all of the slides. This first slide is an image of my feet and crutches taken from above looking down at the ground. I am wearing black shoes, the same shoes I have on right now, and there are blue tape stripes down the front of my grey crutches. The ground is a mottled grey concrete, and there are 2 holes in the ground exactly the same size as the crutch ferrules. Did we find a Polish word for ferrules? Yes, great. Ferrules are the rubber stoppers at the bottom of the crutches. The title of this talk is written in black, which is 4 Legs Good: The Use/Misuse, Study and Distortion of Crutches as Artistic Practice. I am a self-identifying disabled artist based in Glasgow in Scotland, and I am a performance maker and choreographer, performing mainly, actually probably exclusively, in my own work. I don't tend to perform in other people's work very often. Feel free to come on in. I made an announcement that people can come and go. It's absolutely fine. Let me change the slide. There we go. So I've changed the slide now to an image taken in a dance studio, which is of my set of crutches hanging by their elbow cuffs from a ballet bar, which is the only good use really for a ballet bar in my world of dance. There is a plastic lower leg orthotic lying beside them, which was a support I used to wear around my right leg, and a set of shoes are lying beside that on the floor. I started to work in dance in 2003, making my first solo piece, Evolution, in 2007. I didn't train in dance through any traditional routes. I came into it somewhat accidentally, and my traditional training routes, because traditional training routes felt very inaccessible to me as a disabled person. And so my development in working in movement very much came from bespoke training with mentors and from following my own curiosity very specifically. I'm now showing an image of myself seen from the front, wearing a black vest and shorts, and in bare feet. I'm using my crutches in a conventional way, but have lifted my feet up from the ground with one leg swung out to the side and the other foot placed up on the shaft of the crutch about a foot above the ground. Today, my presentation is framed very much around the crutches, my use of them as artistic practice and their shaping of that practice. In the broadest frame, my work shifts from its early explorations of the crutches with my body or other bodies to then, as I've gotten older, being more about how the crutches connect me to the world. For example, how they shape my relationship to environment or to other people in the world. I have often thought of them not only as the tools that I use, in the same way that a painter might use brushes, but also as the lens through which I view the world, sometimes quite literally, as you will see later on. I started to use my crutches when I was about 14 years old, and it was exactly the same style of crutches that I used then as I still use today, given to me by our National Health Service. They are very simple grey and silver elbow crutches, which are adjustable in height. They come apart into 3 sections and have closed cuffs, which are the parts that go around the lower arm. I've been using them now for 28 years, and I keep using the same style, even though there are much cooler, in inverted commas, designs and colours now available. This is a lot to do with the fact that a lot of my movement vocabulary is very specific to the weight and design of these crutches. But it's also about acknowledging that I have a queer relationship with my crutches, in that they are my life companions. And so I think of it as a queer relationship in that term of partnership, but also from the idea that the crutches have queered my body over time as well. And the reason that I also use the same design and style, I think, is probably partly about me making me feel that it's the same set of crutches over 28 years. Of course they're not. I have to buy new pairs of crutches a couple of times every year because I wear them out, because I don't use them in very conventional ways particularly. I go through them very quickly. But I think subconsciously I can still feel like it's the same pair over all the years. I hated them for many years when I first used them as a teenager and into my 20s. But beginning to work with them in a movement context really changed that completely. I'm now showing an image of myself in profile, wearing a short black tutu and black vest. I have my arms in my crutches, and I also have the cuffs of 2 more crutches fastened around my ankles. I am balanced up on all 4 of the crutches, nearly at a horizontal angle, with my face towards the ceiling. My changing relationship to the crutches really came when I began to acknowledge a couple of things, 3 things in particular. Firstly, that the movement I was making was impossible without the crutches. Secondly, that the movement I was making was specific to my physicality, how my body had evolved, its proportions and its strengths, which was in part due to the crutches, but not exclusively. And thirdly, that the movement I was making was possible because I knew the crutches so well, from having used them for 14 years by the time I came into working in dance. I started working in dance at about age 27, I think. And so knowing these objects so well, I compare it to almost how, say, a juggler in the circus might know their equipment, their clubs, their balls, that they know them so well and that they've learned how to work with them. And by using them in my daily life for 14 years, I really understood them. But I didn't realize how much I knew until I began to work in dance. The image I'm now showing is myself in profile wearing a grey, loose-fitting vest and trousers with bare feet. I have bent forward almost double over the handles of both the crutches, which are placed in front of me and are taking my weight and propping up my body at the hips. My feet are on the floor, well, my toes just taking some of my weight, and my upper body hangs over with hands dragging on the ground. The vocabulary that I developed really was generated from 3 sources. And firstly, this came from time spent with the American disabled artist and crutch dancer and choreographer Bill Shannon. And although Bill used a very different style of crutches from me, because he uses the underarm crutches, the shoulder crutches that go into the armpit and are much more common in America, although he used a different style of crutches, he really understood what was possible on crutches in a way that a non-disabled choreographer really couldn't. And so Bill also knew how to push me. So he knew when things could go further and when I wasn't trying hard enough. So I'd like to talk you through some of the things that Bill and I sort of articulated as we began to work together. And with Bill, Bill very specifically developed his vocabulary, and because he came particularly out of breakdancing and hip-hop and skateboarding culture, where all the movements are named, he really encouraged me that you should name your movements. Also, to really articulate it as technique, but also in order to be able to really to repeat movement, to find it again, to be able to actually articulate what exactly you had done. So we came from a practice of really making sure that we understood what we were talking about. So for example, really knowing the names of the parts of the crutch for ourselves. Sometimes it's the name that the industry, the manufacturer might use, or the medical industry, but also sometimes just language that we understood ourselves. So for example, the cuff of the crutch being the part at the top that the arm feeds through. And as I said, I use a closed cuff, which is not so common in other countries, but the open cuff crutches just do not work for me. I will plant my face straight into the ground if I try and use a pair of them. So the cuff then goes into what's called the mid shaft, which is the part that has the handle on it. And then there's what we call the lower shaft, which is the bottom part of the crutch, which can be, in this case, adjusted and changed heights. And then what's known as the ferrule, which is the rubber stopper on the bottom. So making sure that we knew and we had the specific language meant that we could also really reference that throughout the movement. And as I was talking with some of the Polish artists, local artists yesterday, we were really talking about the fact that I was coming into dance and I didn't have the basic tools that dancers understand. And a lot of professional dancers don't even really realize the very basic things that they've understood and learned, and how do you pass that knowledge on. So for example, working with Bill, one of the first things he did was really articulate the different levels that my body could work at. So for example, we categorized it into 4 levels. So there are what are known as what we called aerial movement, which is anything in which the feet are lifted off the ground. So it's usually using the crutches in a conventional way, but with the feet suspended or the body suspended, and all the weight is only in the crutches. So a very simple example of that is a movement that I call the hang stand, which is simply a standing position, but I simply almost levitate myself off the ground. Not sure how far back. Can you see? People in the back row, when do you lose sight of my feet? There? Can you see my feet there? No? Can you see my... Yes, here? Does this work for everyone? All the sighted people in the room, is this good? Okay. So a hang stand is simply to lift up and suspend the body in a standing position, but the weight's going entirely through the crutches. Another aerial move would be what I refer to as a perch, which is where both feet come up onto the mid-shaft of one crutch. And it's called a perch because I think about it a little bit like the way a bird would perch on top of a pole. So it's both feet jumping up onto the mid-shaft. Ooh, need a little bit of practice on this one. And you get a little moment of balance sometimes. But a perch, both feet up onto the mid-shaft of one crutch, perching with your weight up on top for a little moment, hopefully, of suspension and balance. It varies. So those are what I would categorize as aerial movements. And then there's what we called high, which is simply to use them in a conventional or standing height position, movements that stay at the height that I am when I'm standing. Bill would call this position in the saddle because he sits onto his crutches under his arms. It's really like a saddle on a horse. So he calls this in the saddle. It doesn't quite work for me. So this is high. Is anything done at this height, standing height? Then we have what gets called low mids, which is anything where the body is in a lower height, crouched down, or a kind of kneeling height. And involves the crutches switching positions from being used in the hands to being used underneath the arms. So the handles go into the armpits. So low mids is any work where the body is much lower to the ground but not entirely on the floor, and is at a kind of kneeling or crouching height with the handles under the armpits, taking weight. That's low mids. And then there is obviously work that's just generally on the floor, anything that's horizontal with the body to the floor. So floor, low mids, high, aerial were the 4 levels that we put into the vocabulary to identify where the body was moving through. There are static moves or rest positions, some of which you may have noticed already. The first of which is what I call the bench, which is simply to sit on the handle of both crutches. So I put the handles of both crutches together to form a bar, and I sit on it like a bench. I'm going to try and give you the rear view. This often gets quite a lot of attention in public. People kind of feel completely free to just walk around behind me and stare at my butt. But this is called a bench, to sit on both crutches. To sit only on one is therefore a stool. A stool. And a little kind of quirky turn on that is called the swivel stool, which is simply to turn and pivot on the crutch that I'm sitting on, which is done by sort of using the other crutch that my arm is in to push into, and a combination of pushing into the crutch and my 2 feet to turn my body around in a semicircle and do a little half spin is a swivel stool. Yeah. Then we're into traveling moves. The first of which I call the rodeo, from the kind of cowboy term. Cowboy, that's a bit gendered, isn't it? Cow person, cow folk terminology. And a rodeo is where you take one crutch, in this case the right crutch, and you straddle the crutch with both legs. So you put the crutch between your legs, and then by pressing with the right crutch into the right inside of the right thigh, the pressure of this crutch pushing against the leg creates pressure and momentum to turn and move the body out again in another sort of half circle spin. Usually happens much faster. Am I moving too far forward? Is this still good? Here, back row, good. All right, so a rodeo, push into the leg, push and turn around, and it's a spinning, traveling move that takes me off in a sort of, usually a right diagonal. I'm much better at turning to the right than to the left. Quite lazy on my left side. Another move that's so the thing with moving with crutches for me is that it's always a combination of very linear movement and very circular movement, because that's the nature of the object. It's linear, it's full of straight lines, and it's full of circles. The cuffs are a circle, the shaft is a circle, the base is a circle. It works between being a lever and being a pivot, is the behavior of the object. And this is what shapes the way that I then move with it. So it's been a whole sort of training in how to move with the behavior of the object. So it creates a lot of movement that is circular and linear. It's a mixture between those, is the way that it's made me move, or the vocabulary I've developed tends to have that flavour. So for example, another travelling move is what I call the slalom, as in skiing, because I felt it was like slalom skiers. And in a slalom, we're jumping both feet round the side of one crutch, so again in a little semicircle to land with the crutch diagonally behind me. And that's one move. It tends to alternate to travel, so I tend to work by jumping round the right crutch, then doing the same round the left crutch, then down the right crutch. So for me it's got a sort of slalom quality of going from side to side. And the other addition that you just saw there is what Bill would call sliding tips, which is about sliding the tip of the crutch around the floor. This becomes quite an aesthetic thing, but is also about behaviour. Moving it in a linear line is to me, quite unsatisfying to move the tip of the crutch across the floor in a linear line. It wants to move in a circle. It really wants, the behaviour of the ferrule on the bottom makes it want to move in circles. So with slaloming, you tend to accentuate the line of the arm and slide the crutch round in a circle. Sliding tips. There's also step-throughs. And a step-through is where you take one foot up onto the mid-shaft of the opposite crutch, and then you step over the leg, or step through the space in between. And this is a move that you also see, I believe, in tap dancing. It may also exist in other genres. So one foot up onto the mid-shaft, a little bit of pressure into that, and then stepping through. It can also just be a balance for a little while. It can also not follow through. It can go through and then come back. But it's got always a momentum forward or back based on where the weight starts to fall. So it tends to fall into travelling moves for me. So I'm going to have a drink of water now. Excuse me. You might get a very amplified sound of water drinking. Here we go. So another very rudimentary part of the technique that Bill and I really spent time developing for me is also just about the manipulation of the crutches, learning to handle them. So learning to work with them with my hands. And so taking a lot of time, and time that was not always, so time in a studio, really, really learning to work with them, but also just encouraging myself, reminding myself to just spend time fidgeting with them, getting used to learning how they behave. In essence, all of this is about play. It's about permission and time to play. And that's at the core of what made it all possible, was time to play. So time to actually just play with the crutch, learn how to manipulate it, practicing things like what I call a cuff feed, so feeding the hand through the cuff. So really getting used to what is the exact dimension of this space? How do I need to make sure my hand is to go through there quickly and efficiently? How tight, how tense, what speed do I need to use? How do I get used to knowing exactly how to feed it through really quickly in different positions? Yeah? How do I get used to always knowing how to get my hand through, ideally always? How do I know when the crutch is starting to fall exactly where it needs to be. So like that sort of circus training discipline, practicing over and over again to know exactly how it's going to behave. And what Bill would refer to as finger flips. So if Bill does a lovely thing where he turns his crutches around with his fingers and his arms, and for me that's also a practice in finding the handle quickly, in making sure that I can always, no matter where the crutch is, always find the handle really fast. So little things called a finger flip, which really have a slightly stylized possibility to kind of add a little bit of movement, but are also just a really practical thing of learning where the handle is and how to find it in an instant. To be able to always land on it and always find it really quickly. Bill also really encouraged me to treat this like a discipline, to really treat it as something that needed practice. Now I know that my producer will be sitting over there going, she knows that I'm not very good at practicing and discipline, but I did do a bunch of this early on, and that's why it's a foundation now that I can kind of work with. I'm not so good at still doing the discipline so much anymore. But I invented a whole sort of conditioning and training regime for myself when I was first using the crutches in a dance context, in order to build strength, in order to build alignment, in order to really build an awareness of what my kinesphere is. So I really began to understand exactly how big I am when I have my crutches. So I really know exactly where the end of the crutch is, for my own safety, for landing, for catching myself, but also in terms of not hitting other people or objects. So I developed a whole bunch of sort of training exercises specific to the crutches, which are things like leans. They have a lot of comparison to, say, planks, sort of plank exercises in yoga, etc. So, for example, a whole discipline of leaning, which is about, for example, taking one crutch, say the right crutch out to the right-hand side of my body, and just dropping my weight over into the right crutch, so lifting it out of my left foot and left crutch into my right crutch, and then pulling myself back to center and putting all my weight back through center, and then taking the right crutch out again to the side and leaning onto it. But then I would gradually increase this bit by bit, back to center, take the crutch a little bit further out to the side, back to center, a little bit further out to the side, back to center. So really also learning like how much energy, how much push do I need to put into the crutch to pull myself back to center. And then from doing it with a straight arm, I would start to also practice doing it into a bent arm. And so this creates a whole bunch of training for like core strength in the stomach and also through the shoulders. And I would try to practice it on both sides. As I say, I'm a bit rubbish on the left. My alignment goes out when I do the left because I'm not as strong in that side. So that's what happens when you give crutches to people who don't normally use them and they try these sorts of exercises. What tends to happen is you start to really see where the core strength is. For me, it's in my shoulders and in my torso. And that what happens with people who are not used to putting their weight through their arms more and their shoulders is that their bodies start to torque. They really struggle to keep an alignment of the body when they put their weight into their arms. And usually people's bodies start to twist. And this is why we can see that the left side isn't as strong, because I start to lose alignment once I put too much weight out to the side. So I would practice a whole bunch of these side trainings, these leans, and then also versions of what I would call push-ups, but slightly more extreme push-ups, perhaps, which is in taking the crutches out in front of me, putting my weight gradually into the crutches, leaning forward, so a bit like a little bit of a push-up. Feet are still grounded, back where they were, bringing myself back to center, back to standing on my feet, and then gradually taking the crutches in parallel, further out, one step at a time, further and further out, back to center. So they become like really low. I go lower and lower to the floor, and I would do this over, and then I would also take it behind me. So really learning to drill into my body exactly when that point of contact with the floor is going to appear, exactly when it's going to be there, in order to absorb the shock. So one, to the dance people in the room, I plie through my shoulders and my knees, not so much in my shoulders and my elbows, sorry, not my knees. So my plies are here, in my shoulders and my elbows. That's where I absorb all the shock. Not so much in the knees. It's all, my ballet plie is very much in the upper body. So a whole discipline of really learning how to absorb the shock, when to catch myself, and then being able to take it not just out of side and front, but then learning to kind of change the orientation out into different directions, how to catch myself, how to change the facing of my body, and then taking things faster and faster to be able to really move in any direction and be able to catch myself, to turn, and then beginning to also twist the body a little bit, so maybe the legs turn before the torso, just to start finding the variety of ways of moving and turning just from one spot, and always the ability to know how far I can fall and catch myself, and the strength and energy required, and to build the stamina, she says, out of breath, to build the stamina required for this. So yeah, that's a lot of the sort of technique and vocabulary that Bill and I built very specifically, that has formed a really core part of everything that I've done with the Crutches afterwards. Excuse me one moment. Sorry, I'm doing the heavy breathing thing. I'm trying to find the right place for it. There we go. So as well as training with Bill, the other aspect that contributed to my creation of my aesthetic and my vocabulary is time spent with another American artist called Jess Curtis, who is a non-disabled, so I will often use the term non-disabled rather than able-bodied, a non-disabled American artist who was very instrumental in my introduction to movement, and who was grounded in methods of what's called contact improvisation. Is there anyone here who doesn't know what contact improvisation is? Give me a little wave of your arm. No, everyone knows what contact improvisation is? Oh, sorry. So contact improvisation is a dance genre or form, which it's kind of what it sounds like. It's usually done at least between two people, sometimes more, and it's improvised, and it's usually about being in physical contact with at least that one other person. It's very free-form moving. It's because it's improvised, and it doesn't have structured movement in terms of steps or a way it should look. There's a little bit of a dangerous cliche that it's a perfect route in to dance for disabled people, because it doesn't have these normative notions of steps and ways of looking. It works for some people, but I would be very careful to not assume that it's the only way in to dance for disabled individuals. It's a really useful thing for everyone to learn, how to be in physical contact and touch with other people in a safe and consensual way, ideally. And it worked really well for me, and it can be a good dance genre for disabled people, but not exclusively, and is not the only route in. But Jess came very much from contact improvisation, and also was really obsessed with proprioception at the time. So my idiot's definition of that would be the techniques and skills of a body to know where it is in space. And Jess introduced me to movement then from a very inside-out perspective. So it was really about learning about dancing and moving that wasn't about how something looked, wasn't about trying to copy an image or a way of moving or learning steps. It's purely based in a sensorial understanding and response to moving. How did things feel rather than how did things look? Or how should, or it wasn't based in an idea of trying to look like anything or trying to look like somebody else. And that was really, really important to me. I think that was a really vital thing that took away notions of comparison, which is a huge, ugly elephant that's in the room all the time for me, I think, and for a lot of disabled people, particularly coming into dance. The third most important thing in my development of a movement vocabulary after Bill, after Jess, was time alone in a studio, time to play. I was given amazing support by the Creative Scotland, the Arts Council in Scotland, a big development grant, and that allowed me partly just to spend time exploring what was possible for myself without the pressure of other people, or after having learned things, go and play and try and work out what that is for yourself. And that was really vital, and sadly it's a luxury for a lot of people. As part of my beginning explorations, this time spent alone, I really did shut myself in a studio for about 6 weeks. And when I say alone, I of course mean myself and my 2 crutches. And so I didn't have other people to dance with. And one day I came up with this idea, coming out of this contact improvisation learning, where I made a score, what I would call a score or a game, where I decided to think of the crutches as 2 people, or 2 bodies, and to create a little trio, essentially. And so the rule of the dance was that I always had to be giving weight to one crutch and taking the weight of the other crutch. And I realize in retrospect that this way of thinking of them as bodies, has utterly and completely shaped the way that I think and feel and handle or touch the crutches. They are not dead objects to me. You know, my crutch does not feel the same as the clicker for the PowerPoint or a pen to me. They have aliveness for me. Thinking of them as bodies made me start to treat them with care, and realize that I know these bodies very intimately. I know their size, their shape, their weight. I know exactly when they will start to fall, and so usually I can catch them. There's one of the rules as well of the vocabulary that I realize is intrinsically linked to this idea of feeling that they have aliveness, is that there's a kind of unspoken rule for me that the crutches hardly ever leave the floor. So a lot of my vocabulary keeps the ferrule always in contact with the floor. If I lift the crutch off the floor, there's something about it, not always, but most of the time it feels like it kills it. There's something about they only have a life when they have a connection to floor for me. And that's very specific to me. I can watch other people dance with crutches, and they take their crutches through 3 dimensions. It just feels very strange to me. It feels very, very odd to do that, and I can't even explain it. But it kills them as soon as I lift them from the floor quite often. It's a very inward-looking practice. As I said, it's quite sensorial, it's curious, almost scientific, really, the way that I've worked with the crutches. And it's because it's a lot of physics, as I said. There's pivots, there's levers. It's about weight, gravity, leverage. If I put the crutch here, what can I do? If I move it like this, if I shift my weight here, a lot of it has come out of that very scientific way of thinking about moving with the crutches. But using the contact improv influence meant it began to be quite free-flowing, and meant that I also really started using them in much more unconventional ways. And what emerged was more a combination of skills from Bill and from Jess and my own sort of, my really weird curiosity, I guess. So the more contact improv influence of using the sort of one, taking the weight of one and giving weight to the others. So for example, what is this right here that I'm doing, sitting on one crutch? Anyone remember? What's this called? A stool. Well done, thank you. So I'm doing a stool, I'm sitting on one crutch, and then I'm gradually just taking the weight of the other crutch by letting it lean against the inside of my wrist. And this whole game of the giving weight to one crutch and taking weight of the other was really built around this idea of really listening through the skin and practicing how I can move with different parts of my body in contact with the crutch. And really taking the time to learn what's possible. So really listening to this point of contact with the crutch. And not, I don't make the choice. The choice is a communication between me and the crutch. I'm not deciding where the crutch should go. I have to learn where it wants to go with weight and with gravity. If I want to change position, I have to work out how do I take the crutch with its weight and say slide it across the floor, but still work with it. How do I learn to manipulate the crutch a little bit and work with it and change position? So sliding down now into, what position is this? A low mids. A low mids, remember? Yeah. So a low mids position, one crutch in the armpit, swapping, taking the weight into the other. So down into a crouch, really finding where's the point things are going to fall, where are they going to, what do they want, what does this crutch want to do, when's it going to fall, how can I catch it? So it also really made me have to learn how to slow down. And so at the moment now I'm also in a position of using one crutch behind my neck. I'm crouched down. I can feel the cold shaft of the mid shaft against the back of my neck. As I lean some of my weight into my neck, I lean back, taking the weight of the other crutch in the inside of my other elbow. Taking myself lower, down to the floor, into a crouch. Taking the weight of both crutches just gently against my shoulder and my arm. Learning that the weight of the crutches will always shift, that the handle always wants to go to the ground, because the handle is the heavier part of the crutch. Ooh. Sorry, that was the microphone. And then these little rare moments where I might take the crutch from the ground, but really being in a very delicate balance, perhaps, of taking the crutch very gently against the back of my hand and lifting it, finding really the balance points, the edges of where weight and balance want to shift. And that those are the most interesting places to play, always. I think that's a rule for life. So again, often learning that the crutches want to move in circles and pivots, and really moving with them. Bending over, shifting my weight, dropping down, placing the handle of the crutch into my hip, dropping my weight into my right hip, letting my body weight pour through the crutch into the floor. Cuff feed. Yeah. So really spending a lot of time on my own, playing and getting to that place where I really knew how they wanted to behave and what speed we moved at together. One of the things that was interesting with Bill is that I arrived at working with Bill with frustration that I couldn't move fast. I was like, I can't move quickly, I can't move fast on stage. And he said, well, just slow everything else down. And what I realized is that my notion of fast was based on a normative idea of fast. That I thought moving and dancing quickly meant running about and moving really quickly, based on a notion of a normative body. And he was like, if you slow everything down, then your fastest becomes fast and looks fast in comparison. So we did loads of work working really slow. And I think that might have been my first introduction to what I later began to understand as crip time. This term that comes out of, particularly out of American disability studies and crip theory, but the notion of crip time and of having a different relationship to time. And I think that's very core in the way that I move and the way that I'm interested in working as well. How are we doing? So how then does this open up beyond a physical practice into a broader artistic vision or aesthetic? How does this become a connection to the world? I'm showing an image now, looking again at the ground, but this time we can see that I have bare feet in sandals and white trousers and crutches leading down to the ground on either side of my feet. In this case, the ground is a series of roughly cut wooden planks that are uneven and have various sizes of gaps between them. The wood is covered in a very orange dust. This is the handmade bridge built by a farmer who is a landmine survivor in Cambodia. As I've grown older, I've become more fascinated by the subtlety of my lived experience as a disabled person. The small things, the realization that my perception of the world is intrinsically shaped by my impairment. That being disabled shapes how I perceive the world, rather than it only being about how I am perceived in the world. One of the main aspects of my way of being and living in the world is my relationship to the ground. The ground is something that is always very present for me and is rarely, if ever, ignored. Because of the crutches, I am constantly and consistently examining the ground and the floor and the terrain around me with a very heightened awareness of hazards and the qualities of different terrain and the effects of environment, such as water on a floor. I have a direct visual correlation between the placement of my crutches and my vision. So my head and my eyes move in correlation with my crutches. And as such, I notice a place and perhaps even a culture through seeing the ground. And so I began to make a series of photographs that kind of catalogued this way of seeing the world, which I refer to as ground studies. Sometimes these are simply records of a type of terrain, but often I feel they're about capturing the things that many other people miss by not looking down. I'm now showing 3 images that show the grey ferrules, only the ferrules of the crutches, up close and on a grey floor. And further away, they're dispersed at random across the space. And then an image next, which is of my bare feet among ferrules on the floor, where I'm turning the ferrules upright using my toes. And so for me, this beginning to reach out, of connecting to the world, can take many forms, and started with a project called Pink Mist, which was looking at the subject of landmines based on interviews I did in Cambodia. And this idea grew from the realization for me that landmines were objects that created other crutch users. But also it fascinated me particularly because of my relationship to the ground. The research resulted in a performance in which landscapes were created in the theatre, therefore building a world in which the audience are made to bring their attention to the ground in the way that I do, and to pay attention to how they have to move through it. And these crutch ferrules became a little bit like mines for me. Pardon me. I'm now showing 3 images which will show a mostly black screen, but then in each black screen there is a smaller circular image showing various scenes. Some scenes are a bit blurry and some have very bright overexposure. There is an image of a wooden pier, then of a lighthouse and the sea, and then of sunlight reflecting off water and a black fishing boat. I've also begun to compile another photo series, which I refer to as pinhole photos. These are photos literally taken. Literally taken through the hole in the crutch with an iPhone. So this is what I also mean about them being my lens on the world. I became interested in how it felt like this idea of the crutches being my lens on the world, but also because when I look down so much when I'm moving, I don't see everything around me. I can only focus on what's close. And whereas some people might think that this means that I miss out on things, I think it means the opposite. I think it makes me notice what others don't or see things differently. And my growing interest in this desire to connect with the world and into the world is beginning to be around the idea of how the disabled body relates to environment, and in particular the relationship we might have with so-called natural, in inverted commas, environment. I'm interested in how disabled bodies have relationships with places that might be perceived as wild. As someone who thought that these places were inaccessible to me as a disabled person, I'm curious about ideas of what bodies belong in places and who is seen as not belonging. I'm now showing an image of a crutch with twigs or small branches growing out of its holes. The crutch is upright and seen from below, towering over the viewer against the sky. Its silhouette is similar to that of the tall trees in the background. In the forest, for example, I was surprised to find that I felt connected to trees, not particularly in a spiritual way, but in a structural way, of seeing correlation between the crutches and trees and plants in the ways that they are built or the shapes that they form. Showing an image, a close-up image of my hand on the handle of a crutch. The handle of the crutch is covered by the green and brown bark of a tree branch that fits perfectly over the handle of the crutch. So, for example, I felt that I understood the relationship between that trees have with gravity as it manifests in my own body. Trees push down to push up. That's how my body works. I push down in the crutches to push up, or to suspend, or just to move through the world. It's very different from a normal or a bipedal body. These questions of relationship to nature have made me interested in notions of what we consider natural or unnatural. But yet there are times, like organic parts of my body, when their design is in many ways quite organic and natural to my understanding. What are the ways of working or building with them that might convey this organic nature to others? I'm showing an image now of a pile of the middle section of a crutch, the part with the handle, all of which have been arranged to form a rising spiral on a black floor. Now I show 2 of the same spirals of crutches lying on a stony grey beach with blue sky and sea in the background. The crutch parts may look like sea creatures. This recent query has taken my work into creating site-specific durational work, where crutches, pulled from the water in fishing nets as homage to the local fish industry, are then gradually built into large sculptures on the beach. This is a work which, for me, was intended to raise questions around organic and inorganic materials and our readings of bodies and our relationships to objects and nature. I'm now showing an image of myself crouched on a stony beach with bright orange trousers and a blue coat, fitting bits of crutches together in an unusual way. There is a series of large rocks arranged in a line running towards the sea, and from these stones, bits of crutches stick out in lines up into the air, and bits lie alongside on the stones. It is also for me about working publicly and in public and engaging with people who I might not otherwise meet, or those who may not come to see my work in a theatre, and about having conversations with those people. I'm now showing an image of a stony beach in the sunlight with a sculpture built of crutches in the foreground. The crutches are built in a long, thin, curved shapes resembling perhaps the ribs of a boat or a large sea creature. I show an image now of an imp taken down the centre of the sculpture, and the ribs of the crutches curve up to either side, and I'm standing on one of the stones forming the spine of the sculpture, with my back to the camera looking out to sea. This work for me is about moving literally into territory that people might question my presence in, and the crutches' presence, and for me is about raising questions about whether my body is seen by some as unnatural. Where are the lines between human and non-human, in particular when my movement in certain environments is perhaps more animalistic, and when I feel often I am actually a quadruped and not a biped. And that there are at times that I really do think that having 4 legs is far, far better than 2. Thank you.